Once upon a time, there was a man named George Washington. He was born on February the 22nd, 1732, in a small place called Westmoreland County in Virginia. George was the first child of Augustine and Mary Washington. George grew up on a big farm with his brothers and sisters. The farm was called a plantation. They grew tobacco and other crops, and they also had many animals like cows, horses, and pigs. George Washington's life on the plantation was very busy, but it taught him many important skills. As a young boy, George Washington loved to play outside. He enjoyed riding horses, swimming, and exploring the woods. He was strong and brave, but he was also very kind. One of the things that George learned as a child was how to work hard. He helped his family with chores on the farm and learned to take care of the animals. Even though George worked hard on the farm, he also went to school. He learned reading, writing, and math. His teachers taught him about history, too. George was a smart student, but he didn't go to school for many years. His family could not afford to send him to a big school for a long time. But George did not stop learning. He read many books on his own. George Washington loved to learn about other countries and the world. He also liked to study maps and dreamed of exploring new places. When George Washington grew up, he became very interested in the military. The British, who ruled over many parts of America, had soldiers in the land. George wanted to serve his country, so he joined the Virginia Militia, a group of soldiers that helped protect Virginia. In 1753, when George was 21 years old, he started his career as a soldier. George soon became very good at being a soldier. He was brave and smart, and he learned a lot about war. George's first big fight came during the French and Indian War, which happened in North America from 1754 to 1763. This was a war between the British and the French, but many Native American tribes were also involved. During the war, George was made a lieutenant colonel, which was an important rank. He helped lead soldiers in the battles, and he learned how to make important decisions during tough times. Although the war was difficult, George learned many lessons that would help him later in life. After the French and Indian War, George Washington returned to his life on the farm. But the war had changed things in America. The British government wanted to take more control over the American colonies. They started to make new rules and taxes that the colonists did not like. For example, in 1765, the British made a law called the Stamp Act, which forced colonists to pay taxes on many things like newspapers, books, and legal papers. The colonists thought this was unfair because they had no say in the British government. They began to protest and demand their rights. George Washington, like many others, was very upset by the new rules. He believed that the American people should have a say in their government. He wanted to be free from British control. George became involved in the protests against the British. He worked with other leaders to speak out against the British laws and to support the colonists' rights. In 1774, George Washington attended the First Continental Congress, a meeting of leaders from the American colonies. This was a very important time in American history. The people of the colonies were starting to think about independence from Great Britain. They wanted to form their own government and have the freedom to make their own laws. In 1775, the situation became even more serious. The colonists were angry at the British, and the British were not listening to the colonists' demands. A war broke out between the British soldiers and the American colonists. This was called the American Revolution. George Washington was chosen to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, the Army of the American Colonies. This was a very important job, and many people believed that George was the right person to lead the army. At the time, the American army was not strong. They did not have many soldiers, and they did not have enough money to buy the things they needed. The soldiers were not well trained, and they often did not have enough food or clothing. But George Washington was determined to win. He was brave and smart. He made difficult decisions and inspired his soldiers to keep fighting, even when things were very hard. The war lasted for many years, and it was not easy. There were many battles and many times when the American soldiers were close to losing. But George Washington never gave up. One of the most famous battles was the Battle of Trenton in 1776. On Christmas night, George and his soldiers crossed the Delaware River to surprise the British soldiers in Trenton. The battle was a big victory for the Americans, and it gave hope to the people who were fighting for independence. The war continued for several more years. With the help of other countries like France, who sent soldiers and supplies to support the Americans, George Washington and his army were able to win the war. Finally, in 1781, the British Army surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown. This was the end of the American Revolution, and the United States of America became an independent country. After the American Revolution, George Washington was a national hero. People admired him for his courage, leadership, and determination. In 1787, a group of leaders came together to create a new government for the United States. They wrote a document called the Constitution, which set up the rules for how the new government would work. In 1789, the people of the United States chose George Washington to be the first president of the country. It was a big honor, but George was nervous. He didn't want to be too powerful, and he wanted to make sure that the new government would be fair. As president, George Washington worked hard to make the new country strong and peaceful. He created a group of people to help him make decisions. This group was called the Cabinet, and it helped him with important jobs like managing the army, the economy, and foreign relations. George Washington served 2 terms as president, from 1789 to 1797. During his time in office, he worked hard to set good examples for the country. He helped make important decisions, like deciding to stay neutral in foreign wars and setting up the first national bank. George also helped create a strong government that would last for many years. After 8 years as president, George Washington decided it was time to retire. He returned to his farm in Virginia, where he spent his last years. People respected him and were sad to see him leave the presidency. George Washington had helped create a new country, and he had led it with honor and wisdom. He was called the father of his country because of all the great things he had done. George Washington died on December 14, 1799, at the age of 67. People across the United States mourned his passing. They remembered his bravery, his leadership, and his love for his country. Today, we still honor George Washington. He is remembered as one of the most important leaders in American history. In many places across the United States, you can find statues, schools, and even cities named after George Washington. His face is on the $1 bill, and his legacy continues to inspire people around the world. George Washington was a man who worked hard, never gave up, and loved his country. He helped lead the United States to independence, and he became the first president of the country. His life is an example of what it means to be a strong and honorable leader. George Washington's story teaches us that with courage, dedication, and love for others, we can achieve great things. He will always be remembered as a hero in American history.